Hi everyone, it's Michelle here. Welcome back to Grounded Haven Homestead. Today I am out in the garden and I'm going to be transplanting some seedlings. This is the first round of seedlings that I'm transplanting into the garden, so it's a very exciting start. Today I'm going to be mostly transplanting onions along with leeks and shallots, and then I also have some bok choy that looks like it's ready to transplant. Here's a look at the bok choy. It's looking really nice and healthy. You can see that all of these have their first set of true leaves and the second set is just starting to grow. You can probably hear one of our chickens in the background laying. She's making her egg laying call, so it might be a little loud, but yeah, so these bok choy look like they are ready to go in. Originally, I had planned on transplanting my cabbage and broccoli around this time, but they are just growing so slowly. You can see that they are just starting to get their first set of true leaves, and these were planted, I think, 2 weeks before the bok choy, so the bok choy is just growing a lot faster. The bok choy I started on February 21st, and this cabbage and broccoli I believe I started in the beginning of February. Here's a look at the onions and leeks that I'm planting. These ones I started on January 14th, and today is March 15th, so it's almost 2 months on the dot. They're looking really nice. You may start to see the little starts of the onions down there. All of these plants have been hardened off properly. They've actually been living outside in our unheated greenhouse. Unless it gets down to like 10, 15 degrees, then I'll bring them inside. But for the most part, they stay in the greenhouse and I bring them out on sunny days. So they're hardened off to temperature as well as sun. You really want to make sure that you are hardening off your seedlings properly before you put them outside. Otherwise, they can go into shock from too much sun or too much cold. They just need to get a little accustomed to the outside world before they settle into their permanent home. So most of the planting I'm going to be doing today is in our raised bed garden behind me. Some of the onions are destined to be in our in-ground garden in the very back area, but I don't think I have enough compost today to get to those, so those might be saved for another day, but I'll show you the process of how to plant all of these things. So this bed here is the one I'm going to be planting the bok choy in. It is the second bed on the left in the front of our garden. This bed is 3 feet by 6 feet, and I think I'm only going to need half of this bed. So I'm going to use this side, and depending on how much space I have some kale that's been living in the greenhouse that I might just go ahead and plant on this side. And this bed has already been amended with compost. I put some chicken bedding in here during the winter, so it's been breaking down further and aging. And also we added a top layer of some purchased leaf compost. It's really nice and black and rich. So I'm just going to go in real quick and just like break up the surface of the soil, and then I'm going to take a stick and just like make little imprints so that I can space out everything for my bok choy seedlings. Since I have space in that bed still, I think I'm going to take some of these kale greens. I was trying out planting these in the greenhouse over the winter in a potting bag, and they definitely survived, but I really haven't harvested from these because they haven't gotten any bigger than like these tiny little leaves. They might be too crowded, but they're alive and they definitely have roots growing nicely, so I think what I'm going to do is just like grab chunks of this and like place it into the raised bed, and hopefully they can get a little bigger with a little bit more space and nutrients. So here is the finished bed. On this side we have all of our bok choy, and I just love how organized and neat they are. And then on this side we have this mess of a block of kale. I literally just planted the entire thing as if it was like one pot because it was just staying together pretty nicely. So I don't know, we'll see how it does. It's looking really nice and lush actually. So what I'm gonna do is cover this with frost fabric just because I already have these hoops set up here. They don't really need it in terms of frost protection, but since the days are starting to get a little bit warmer and the bugs are coming out, both bok choy and kale are brassicas, which means that those little white moths can lay their eggs and the caterpillars can eat your vegetables. So I would rather just prevent all that from happening by setting up frost fabric as a preventative measure. So yeah, I'll just go ahead and do that now. Before I go out to my bed to transplant these onions, I'm going to separate them out first at my table. I'll just make things a little bit easier once I get there, because as you can see, I've planted these onion seeds very densely, and I don't actually know how many seeds in here have germinated and how many onions or leeks or whatever I'm going to have. So if I just separate these out now, it'll make it faster when I am kneeling down and planting. It's more comfortable to do this at a table first, and also that way I can count how many seedlings I have and kind of plan out my spacing and how much space I'm going to need in my beds. So I've just pulled out this container of leeks. You can see how the roots have gone down to the bottom, but they don't really tangle with each other. They just like go straight down. So they're really easy to separate. You just have to like tease them apart. I can already smell them. They smell so good. Okay, and now you can already start separating as you loosen it. So just be gentle, but they do untangle very easily. So there's one leek seedling. It looks so puny, I know, but it'll grow just fine. Last year I didn't really have high expectations. It was my first year growing onions, and the seedlings were just so puny and tiny, and when you plant them in the soil they look just even wimpier because they're just like engulfed in soil, and it kind of makes you think that they're not going to grow into anything, but I promise you they will. You can buy onions from sets, but I think it's more reliable to grow them from seeds yourselves, because onions grown from sets were actually started the previous fall and they sit in dormancy throughout the winter, versus I started these in January, so they haven't been sitting all winter, they've just been growing actively. And when onions and leeks and shallots go through that dormancy period, the next year they might not grow as large because they technically are supposed to flower the second year. So they might not get as large as if you started them from seed yourselves. And the second thing that can happen is they can actually flower instead of forming the bulb, so you won't actually get something that will store well. It might be like a little bit hollow inside because that flower stem is starting to develop. So yeah, that's why I like to grow my onions from seed. You can see just how easily these are untangling, and I've already untangled a good number of these, so I definitely had good germination with these leeks. Even though they don't have like a huge network of roots, these roots are pretty strong and sturdy. It's pretty amazing. This one looks really nice. You pretty much plant shallots and onions the same way. Leeks are a little bit different, so I will show you that when I go to plant these. There's something so satisfying about separating all of these out. And it's crazy that all of these plants took up such a tiny little pot. You need so little space to start so much food for these onions and leeks. I feel like I've already untangled like at least 30 leeks. So hopefully I have a total of like 50 in the end, which is incredible. So here's my finished bundle all separated out. Okay, cool. So I just counted and I have 47 in here. So I was pretty close to my estimate of 50. I think I'm just gonna start with these ones. And I'll leave these ones aside because I don't know how much space I'm gonna have to do all of these. So let me go start with these, show you how to plant them, and then I can come separate the rest of my onions out. So I'm at the bed where I'm going to be planting my leeks, and this has already been amended with compost, so we don't have to worry about that. If you haven't amended your bed, you really want to pretty heavily amend it for any alliums because they do need a lot of fertilizer to grow. So what I'm going to do is I have this little like dibber tool. You can just use like a pencil or something. And I'm going to start making little holes in my soil. Actually, I think I'm going to need to wet this down first because it's pretty dry and crumbling. So let me do that first. Alright, so there we are, just gave it a nice little sprinkle. So as I was saying, just take something and make a hole about 6 inches deep. And I'm going to try and space these pretty closely, maybe like 4 inches apart. And I'm just going to go through and make a bunch of these holes first. Alright, so there are a few just to get us started. And now what you're going to do is take your little leek seedling and you plop it in the hole. And that is literally it. I'm not going to cover these with soil at all. And if you need to get the roots down there, you can use your little tool just to push the roots down. Try and get the base of the plant down to the bottom of the hole. You can see how once you're done, you can barely see the tip of the leek plant. And the reason I do it this way, it's actually what's recommended on the back of my Johnny's packet. And the reason you do this is because when you buy leeks at the store, it has like the white part at the bottom and then a long green part. And normally you would eat like the white part because it's more tender and a little bit sweeter. The green parts are pretty fibrous. So really the white part is what you want when you're growing a leek. Kind of like how when you grow an onion, you just want the bulb and typically you don't get the greens with it. With this method of planting, these seedlings are not covered with soil, but as you water, that soil is going to start to slowly fill up that hole week after week. And as this plant grows up, it's going to naturally be blanched by that soil that is going to eventually cover up the base of the plant. And you'll end up with a really nice long white part of the leek, which is the part that you want to eat most. And with this method, you get to get the base of the plant really far and deep down. But since it's not covered right now, the sun can still get to the leaves. And by the time the hole completely fills up, these plants will be larger and they'll have more leaves sticking up. So this is how I did it last year. It worked out really well. I had a nice long area of white on my leeks. If you didn't plant your leeks this way, another way you can get that really long white and light green area of the leek without doing this method is to plant them at a normal depth, just covering up the very base where you can see it's starting to create almost like a bulb. And then as it grows, you can trench it up with soil, kind of like the way you would trench potatoes as they grow. And this will also create that blanching process. But I think it's just easier to do it this way because then you don't have to do anything in the middle of the season. Separating out the rest of the seedlings is going to be the same exact process as I did for the leeks. Next, I'm going to be working on my shallots, which are going to go in another one of my smaller raised beds. And here are what those seedlings look like. You can already see just a little start of that bulb starting to develop and they're looking really nice. I've never grown shallots before, so this is going to be something new for me, but I imagine it's the same process. They are also in the allium family. The only thing is that shallots are a little bit smaller, so you should be able to space them closer together. So I'm going to space them only about 2 to 3 inches apart. The bed that I'm going to be planting these in hasn't been amended yet, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, just adding a good layer of leaf compost on top here. And then I'm just going to start planting these shallots. These ones don't have to go through the same process as the leeks, where you make a hole that's like 6 inches deep and leave them kind of exposed. These ones you just plant as you would plant a normal transplant. Just try not to bury them too deep because onions don't typically like to be planted very deeply. You just want to cover just that area where you see that bulb is starting to develop. I did end up deciding to plant the rest of my onions in my in-ground bed. I originally thought I wouldn't have enough compost, but I did have this other half of this bag, and I also found a bed that we had amended in the fall with some homemade compost as well. So between what we did in the fall and what I'm adding now, I think this should be pretty good. If it looks like it needs more nutrients, I will top dress in the middle of the season as these onions are growing. So I just added that compost on top and just lightly broke up the surface of the soil a little bit with a digging fork. I don't usually have to do this in my raised beds because the soil is a little fluffier, but in-ground beds like this tend to get a little bit more compacted. So I just like to loosen it up just a little bit. And here are the onion seedlings that I'm going to be working with. I have 3 varieties and I've already separated these out. So all I have to do is pop them into the soil. For these onions that I'm hoping will get a little bit larger, I'm going to try and space these 4 to 6 inches apart, so a little bit farther apart than I did the leeks and the shallots. Alright, so it did take the better part of the day, but I ended up getting everything planted, which I'm so happy about. So here's the first bed that I planted up with that kale and the bok choy. The next bed over has the shallots that I planted, and then I had some extra space, so I planted a variety of onion that is a longer red onion. So I think they don't take up as much space width-wise. For shallots, I ended up with, I think, 80 to 90 of those. For these onions, I had 30 or 40. Moving on to the other side of the garden, this is the bed with the leeks. I didn't use all of the bed. This little space here is empty, but all of this is leeks, and I think I had 120 of them, perhaps. You can see all of those little holes that I haven't filled in. And then moving on to my back bed, I ended up fitting all the onions in this one bed, which I'm really happy I was able to get everything fit. I was getting worried for a second that it wouldn't all fit. I have 3 varieties here. The first one is Cortland, and I only had about 10 of those. Then the Cabernet red onion, and I had 120 of those. Really good germination on those seeds. And then in the back I have my Australian brown onions, and I think I ended up with like 60 of those maybe. And they really don't look like much. They literally just look like single blades of grass sticking up out of here. It's kind of crazy how puny they are, but once they grow up, this is going to be so much food. So that's it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.